Your warning there is not just then about warnings in December and January being missed. It's about warnings going back to the 80s. What was not in place that should have been?
Well, good morning and thank you. We've known over the last 20 or 30 years that the evolving nature of human civilizations, in particular urbanization, economic growth, the emergence of slum areas in the peripheries of cities has created an environment which is highly conducive to what we call zoonoses, which is where viruses that exist in animal populations spill over, literally jump from those animals into human beings. And over the last 30 years, we've seen an increasing number of these spillover infections take place. So we should have been prepared for this to happen again. And very sadly, although we knew it was the number one risk in many Western countries, we were not prepared.
And is your criticism, Richard, particularly at the UK, the US, or all of them? Do you think that the response can be differentiated from country to country? Because arguably some continental European countries have done better than others.
No, I think that each country has failed in its own unique way, but there has been a systematic failure to understand that the threat was less from pandemic influenza, which is what we prepared for example, in the United Kingdom and in many other continental European countries, but the much bigger threat was from these, as I call them, zoonoses. Remember what happened in China in the early 2000s with the SARS outbreak. That was an alarm signal to the world. Here was a virus that jumped from an animal to a human being and almost triggered a worldwide pandemic. We got lucky in the early 2000s. A global pandemic wasn't triggered, but we didn't learn the lessons, or at least Western countries didn't learn the lessons. Those who did learn the lessons included China, which is why China reacted with such draconian measures as they seemed to us in the West in January. But they got it right. They knew what was coming.
It's interesting, and your criticism around the UK, I know at the time, in March, you were talking about how tougher lockdown measures needed to come quicker than they were coming from the UK government. But the answer from the government, and actually from the scientists who were advising them, was that the outbreak in the UK was running behind other parts of Europe. It wasn't appropriate for the UK to do things at the same time as Europe, and that if measures were introduced too soon, they would not be stuck to. Was there any merit to that argument?
Well, clearly not, because, in fact, when you look at lockdown took place in Britain on March the 23rd, but if you actually look at what the population was doing, they had already seen what had happened in China. They'd seen what had happened in northern Italy. They knew that this virus was on its way across Europe, and people had already they weren't listening to government. They'd already started their own personal family lockdowns. It's just no excuse to say that we didn't know that this was coming. We knew in the very last week of January what was taking place. We knew that this was a new virus with no treatment and no vaccine that was tipping thousands of people into hospital, into intensive care with a very high mortality rate. All of that was known in the last week of January. There is no place to hide for government in saying that they were not warned about the dangers of this pandemic. And that is why, very sadly, in this reckoning that needs to take place, we have to conclude that tens of thousands of our citizens have died avoidably. These were unnecessary deaths because of systematic government misconduct.
Richard, when we think about where this virus goes next, do we think about it in terms of waves? Do we prepare for a second wave in the UK and elsewhere, as it's talked about? Or do we prepare to live with the virus for another 12 months or longer? How should we think about this into the future?
Well, first thing to say is that there's a lot that we don't know about the virus. But here's what's emerging. First of all, the biggest threat right now isn't the second wave, but it's actually a flare-up of the first wave. And I think I'm very concerned that we've eased lockdown without a proper test, trace and isolate system in place. As I look in London, which is where I live, I see a lot of people gathering in groups without wearing masks, without practicing physical distancing. We have all the conditions in place for a very serious flare-up. So I'm very worried about the risk of that. But let's say that we do get through this particular very dangerous period. It seems that this virus has seasonality. That's to say that it comes in waves according to the seasons. And the latest predictions that I've seen in the last few days are that we could have a second wave come through in September and peak by Christmas time. So I think we do need to be prepared for a second wave later this year. And that then means, how are we going to respond to that? And that's a very difficult question for governments, because we can't go through 3 to 4 month lockdowns again. Otherwise, we really will destroy our economy for good. So we're going to have to think about maybe short lockdowns for maybe 2 weeks, and then 6 weeks back to some semblance of normality, and then maybe another 2 weeks again. So a lot of different models are currently being examined to see how we could get through the second wave.